Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Monday the 17th of January. I'm Andrew Wilson and this is Scotland at 7. First we will have today's coronavirus update, then I'll introduce this evening's guest, and then together we will discuss today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. As of 2 p.m. today, there have been 6,221 cases identified using a first lateral flow device or a PCR positive test today. Of the people who have tested positive, 1,557 were in hospital last night, 43 of whom were in intensive care. There are no new reported deaths of people who have tested positive, and that means that the number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 10,038. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. The latest UK daily figures show that 152,075 patients who tested positive for COVID have sadly died from their illness, and that is an increase of 85 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just in hospitals. And as of 8 a.m. this morning, 4,400,229 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, 4,087,517 had received their second dose, and 3,204,311 had received their third dose or booster. Now, we are lucky enough this evening to be joined by a regular contributor, the retired Professor of Media and Politics, and now writer and media commentator, Professor John Robertson. John, good evening. How are you keeping?
Good evening. I'm well as can be expected.
On a Monday in January. Well, thank you for joining us in Scotland at 7, John. It's great to see you. Our first story this evening is that First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has welcomed the truly historic opportunity for Scotland's net zero economy as the winners of the ScotWind offshore wind leasing auction were today announced by Crown Estate Scotland. 17 projects with a combined potential of generating capacity of 25 gigawatts have been offered the rights to specific areas of the seabed for the development of offshore wind power, with developers giving commitments to invest in the Scottish supply chain, providing opportunities for high-quality green jobs for decades to come. The projects are expected to secure at least £1 billion in supply chain investment for every 1 gigawatt of capacity proposed. They will also generate around £700 million in revenue for the Scottish Government and represent the world's first commercial-scale opportunity for floating offshore wind. As well as helping complete Scotland's own journey to net zero, creating thousands of jobs in the process, our offshore wind resource also has the potential to position Scotland as a major exporter of renewable energy, including green hydrogen. Commenting, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said, "The scale of opportunity here is truly historic. ScotWind puts Scotland at the forefront of the global development of offshore wind, represents a massive step forward in our transition to net zero, and will help deliver the supply chain investments and high-quality jobs that will make the climate transition a fair one. It allows us to make huge progress in decarbonising our energy supply," she continued, "vital if we are to reduce Scotland's emissions, while securing investment in the Scottish supply chain of at least £1 billion for every gigawatt of power." So, John, one aspect of this that you and I have spoken about before, but just in light of the scale of today's ScotWind announcement, the current regime of connection and transmission charges means that the distribution grid charges for Scotland are the highest in Europe, and that electricity, especially green electricity generated in Scotland and then transmitted south, subsidises electricity generated in England. Do you think there's a prospect of that playing field being levelled properly?
Well, that may be the case. Maybe that will happen, but it does look with this announcement, it looks as if there's a juggernaut here, which won't be held back even by these unfair penalties. I think the figure is 25 gigawatts. So I had a quick look at the research. 25 gigawatts will power 16 million houses. 16 million. How many houses are there, homes are there in Scotland? 2.3 million, about 23 million in England. So you can see the possibilities here, regardless of charges, the possibilities for an independent Scotland to sell some of this, what's going to be a massive oversupply. And actually, would actually, I think, perhaps confirm what Alex Salmond said many years ago, that Scotland can become the Saudi of wind. These floating wind farms are tremendously productive. They're bigger, they produce more electricity, and they're constantly exposed to wind because it's never calm out in the North Sea.
Absolutely right. And your description there, John, as a juggernaut certainly aligns with what I was thinking when I was reading these numbers and thinking of the scale here. One thing that the First Minister has been very clear on today is the underlining the scale of the investment and describing that in terms of per gigawatt. She's told us in her statement that the investment that they expect in the supply chain will be about £1 billion per gigawatt. So that's a £25 billion juggernaut, if those numbers are correct. Now, there have been undertakings given by those who've been successful in the auction today that their investment and their supply chain will have a Scottish aspect to it. Now, thinking about our recent experience with jackets and turbines, production of that being moved away from Scotland, what do you think the prospect is of securing that level of investment in Scotland, both looking at this from a historical perspective, but also looking at it in terms of the size of the prize here now? £25 billion is a lot of cash.
I think the critical mass, as you mentioned there, the size of the prize here, maybe lead to a kind of tipping point where we do actually start to get construction work in Scotland, which has disgracefully not been developed due to the lack of interest of this government in the UK and the previous one. I read something recently about a development in Glasgow in the 1990s, which was well ahead of the game in developing these wind farms, but the funding was taken away by the new Labour government at the time. So it's long overdue, but I think maybe it's going to happen now.
And do you think that the way in which the First Minister has characterised this announcement today, in terms of firstly in terms of our journey to net zero, but also our journey to a fair transition, and thereby decarbonising the fossil fuel production sector in Scotland, do you think the combination of those things coming today, does it helpfully underline and support the arguments and the approach that the First Minister was taking during COP26?
Yes, it kind of reinforces a lot of that, and it's that business of the kind of critical mass and the tipping point when everything comes together. We've all been quite, I think, frustrated about developments here over the last 10 years ago, that the potential hasn't been properly developed. But I think it might all be coming together now, and I think the First Minister has been saying the right things. I don't want to come across here as somebody just saying how well the Scottish Government's doing about everything. I think the corporations, the energy companies, they know what's happening. They have made huge profits in the past. They've paid virtually no tax in the UK compared to the tax they've paid in Norway. So I think they will be part of the push, because they recognise it's in their interests to do an effective transition and a fair transition, to keep employees, to encourage training of new employees. So I think, while I'm no great fan of the energy companies, I think in some ways their energy, their sense of purpose, profit making, might actually push this thing over the finishing line, so to speak.
That's a very good point, John. And also, just briefly in that context as well, of course, the auction was held by, and the leases will be granted by, Crown Estate Scotland. And of course, Crown Estate Scotland has gone through some changes from the old Crown Estate, and as has been pointed out, the revenue from these leases will go to the Scottish Government, not to the Treasury. Is that another example of the traditional way of doing things in Scotland, of that being revised and being more appropriate for a modern Scotland?
It does look like a change of that nature. It does. It's difficult not to be optimistic about this. No doubt there's something I don't know about the taxation and about the possibilities that the UK government has for somehow draining these resources as they have in the past. But it does look pretty promising to me.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. I'm sure that normal, less positive service will be resumed shortly. Don't worry. We'll move to our next story now, and that is, in a statement to the House of Commons today, UK Government Culture Secretary Nadine Dorris said she would freeze funding for the BBC for 2 years and begin a debate on whether a universal licence fee should continue, drawing opposition complaints of cultural vandalism. Ms Dorris said that the corporation at the heart of the UK's cultural life needed to become a simpler, leaner organisation at a time when the public were facing rising energy and tax bills. Ms Dorris said the tax on all television-owning households that funds the broadcaster would be frozen at £159 a year until 2024, before it can rise in line with inflation for the following 4 years. Despite Ms Dorris saying the new licence spending settlement would give the BBC around £3.7 billion, analysts have said a below-inflation budget will force the corporation to cut services. Ms Dorris had to begin her statement with an apology after the Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, rebuked her for tweeting about this announcement yesterday and for the fact that it was briefed to the papers. The Speaker said that if this was a leak, as Ms Dorris claimed, and she was only responding on Twitter because she felt she had to, then there should be a formal leak inquiry. So, John, there's quite a lot to unpack in this story for us this evening. So, first of all, in order to get some context from your perspective, is it worthwhile in our discussion separating out the institution of the BBC and separating that from its recent and current ways of operating? Or have those current and recent ways of operating, have they fatally poisoned the institution as a whole, in your view?
I think it was long poisoned. I know many of us up here, people pro-independence, would see this as it seems like a fairly recent phenomenon, BBC Scotland's terrible bias against the independence movement. And I know people who used to work for the BBC, and they often describe it as bad apples, and that there are good people still there. I think there's a culture at the BBC which has a long history of bias. It was only in 2013 that I took any interest in representation of bias in Scottish politics. And one of the reasons for that was I remember my vice principal research, a man from Alexandria in Egypt, said of me, John is very good, but he's too Scottish. That was because I tried to publish some of my work in Scottish journals rather than international ones. And so much of my research on bias was bias by the Western media against the Arab world and bias against working class movements in the UK. And I published peer-reviewed research into the lack of representation of trade unions in discussions on the economy and in the reporting of the several interventions in the Arab world, in particular in Iraq, but others too. And I was informed there by Noam Chomsky and by Edward Said, two of the greatest public intellectuals in the 20th century, I should say. And when you look back, BBC Scotland's naked bias, I've got some notes to one side here, which I'm going to cheat with. They're to my left. They'll look like they're to your right, I suppose, because we're mirrored here. And so if you see me looking across, I'm reminding, I am 70, so I'm entitled to check. So the naked bias against the independence movement is just the most recent example of this. But I think, there's a justification for binning the whole venture, public service broadcasting. If it's public service broadcasting, either serves the interests of the market, of the corporations, and the kind of right of centre politics and you get in liberal democracies, or it serves the interests of some totalitarian regime, communist or fascist. It's not a model that works. I'm very happy to have a great deal of my world socialised. Healthcare, infrastructure, taxation, fair taxation, progressive taxation. But when it comes to ideas, I want to choose them myself. I don't want some kind of paternalistic state institution telling me what the world is like out there. I don't trust them. And if you look back at, so we've had the most recent example with the bias against independence, the clearly proven bias. But they promote the UK monarchy uncritically, as if we were living in Game of Thrones. They constantly ignore the brutality of our trading partner, Saudi Arabia. In the early 20s, there's a bit of a rant here, so I hope you'll forgive me. I'll finish it quickly as I can. In the early 21st century, they championed NATO military adventures, killing millions in the Arab world and basing that on dodgy. Now, people say that the BBC was attacked by the Blair regime. The evidence from research is that the BBC complied with the war agenda. There was some suggestion that Channel 4 and one or two Scottish newspapers were more critical of the war agenda, but the BBC was not, despite what Alistair Campbell said. There's research evidence for that. Think from Cardiff. In the 70s and 80s, they totally misrepresented working class politics and demonised union leaders. It's remarkable how BBC Scotland treats union leaders today, but in the past, they completely demonised them or ignored them. And they worked on behalf of the business community almost entirely. And for decades, back in the right through to the present, they've confused their viewers over the nature of the conflict in Palestine. And there was work done by Glasgow University which demonstrated this very clearly. They showed people off the street in Glasgow BBC reporting on the dispute in Palestine, and they asked them questions afterwards. The vast majority, after watching BBC coverage of Palestine-Israel, thought that the Palestinians were recently arrived immigrants, that the Israelis were the original settlers, and that the Palestinians had come along and were causing trouble. I mean, that's just reversal of the truth. And as for David Attenborough, these people say, oh, we'd lose David Attenborough. Now, this sometimes causes more anger in people I argue with than any other topic, but David Attenborough, at least until the recent kind of global warming emphasis in his programmes, I think his work was largely animal death porn, where you watch to see if some cute little creature was about to be torn to shreds by a bigger, sharper-toothed creature. That's what most of the programmes are about. And most recently, his stuff on global warming is, I'm afraid, may well be accurate, I don't know, but it's clearly biased. It's largely an evangelical campaign supporting the dominant global warming thesis that things are heating up and they're going to heat up even more and millions are going to die. And the latter part is the product of peer pressure and the construction of truth by academics who are no less easily influenced by their peers than the rest of us are. So that's my rant about this. I'll happily see the BBC go, and if I can finish, when I buy a book from Amazon, I know I shouldn't, when I buy a book from Amazon, I do use the local bookshop too, when I buy a book from Amazon, it often says, people who bought that also bought this. I find that much more trustworthy than anything BBC tell us.
Thanks, John. I knew you have a perspective on this particular story.
Don't hold back.
That's okay. There's one other element of this that I was going to talk to you about as well, and that was more from the political perspective. The argument about funding the BBC, to my mind, has been going on for some time. So for it to reappear this morning or over the weekend and then into the House of Commons today suggests to me that there's obviously something to do with the timing. The Times political cartoon makes the suspicion rather transparent, marking this down as another of Johnson's dead cats. And that's very much the view of The Guardian as well, who had its overnight piece was headed, Johnson accused of targeting BBC to save his premiership, claiming that a government insider says that the announcement about abolishing the licence fee was not expected this weekend. So do you think is the demise of the BBC being used as a dead cat by Johnson to distract from his other more significant problems? And if it is, do you think it's going to be enough to distract from Partygate?
I don't think it's going to be enough. It may be the case that that's been part of the thrust here, but people like Nadine Dorries and the several, maybe 100, I don't know, right-wing, anti-Europe MPs in the Conservative Party who've been long-term opposed to the BBC, think the BBC is biased against them. I think, that they're taking the opportunity just now, and they'll push ahead with that. I should say, controversially, that back in the 90s, I did some research into BBC coverage of New Labour at the time, the Blair government, and the Conservative Party at the same time. And there was clear evidence that the BBC favoured New Labour, favoured Blair over the Conservative Party. So,
Oh yes, I think if you take the view that the BBC continues to be an agency of the state, an agency of the government, then it's not a surprise, I suppose, that it favoured the New Labour under Blair and would be perceived by others as favouring Tory administrations since. That's probably part and parcel of the way in which the BBC is constituted at the moment.
It's a state broadcaster. It's a state broadcaster, always has been, and I don't want one. I don't think Scotland should have one either. I don't think there should be a Scottish equivalent of the BBC. No, and there are huge problems with corporate-owned media. I understand that, but social media has seriously weakened that.
Absolutely. It does feel a little bit like all of the BBC's opponents have come together at this point in time. After all, if only we knew why a government that met 42 times with Rupert Murdoch in its first 6 months in office is apparently so keen to kill off the BBC. But I'm sure we'll come back to the story and examine it in great detail, and I'm very grateful to you for your thoughts and your analysis this evening. But we'll move on to our next story now. The SNP has condemned the appalling reports that Boris Johnson intends to send military gunships to target vulnerable refugees crossing the Channel as part of a series of toxic policies to distract from Tory party scandals and to appease his extreme Tory backbenchers. With pressure building on Boris Johnson to resign and on backbench Tory MPs to act to remove him from office over numerous rule-breaking boozy lockdown parties, Johnson has reportedly launched Operation Red Meat, a desperate bid to woo Tory MPs and to save his own skin through another round of harmful policies. The anti-refugee plans also include reports that he intends to send those seeking asylum to offshore detention facilities in Rwanda and Ghana. Commenting, the SNP's Shadow Home Secretary, Stuart MacDonald MP, said, "Reports that the Tory government intends to put the military in charge of targeting vulnerable refugees in rickety boats and to send them overseas to detention facilities are utterly appalling. It is shameful that Boris Johnson is putting forward these toxic policies in a desperate attempt to woo his right-wing backbench MPs, distract from the scandals engulfing his party, and to save his own skin." He continued, "The SNP has been consistently clear that the UK government must step up efforts to secure safe and legal routes for people fleeing hardship, poverty and conflict, including refugees from Afghanistan left behind after the UK's chaotic exit from that country." So, John, firstly, if this apparent plan is put into place and the Royal Navy are put in charge of patrolling the English Channel and pushing refugees and asylum seekers back towards France, do you think, is there a risk here of politicising the work of the armed forces? I'm reminded that I don't think the government has yet pushed through its plans to put UK service personnel who served in Northern Ireland above and beyond the criminal law yet. But the comparison in terms of politicising what the army is asked to do struck me. So do you think, is there a risk if the Navy are deployed here?
Yes, of course. I mean, there's been a long-term risk of politicising the police force too in terms of protest, and so that this strikes me as, it's not entirely surprising given the nature of the leadership here, people like Priti Patel, but the steps towards a fascist state are small steps at first, and you sometimes, you might look back and wonder how you got there. I mean, I find it quite shocking that we're thinking about this. I can't imagine we would have been thinking about this, say, 5-10 years ago, the idea of setting the armed forces in a position like this, which they probably don't want to be in, but they're trained to be violent. They're trained that violence is their purpose. They will make mistakes with these people. More people will die, and then of course there's the crazy idea if they don't die, and if they're not drowned by the wash from some frigate accidentally going too close to them, then they're sent to Rwanda. Rwanda, a place of genocide only a few years back, a place where on every corner you'll probably find bones and mass burials. The idea of sending people from different parts of the world to Rwanda is just crazy, and the consequences could be appalling.
Now, that's a good point, John. I was going to ask you about that. The idea of using offshore detention, of establishing and using offshore detention centres. I know that Australia has done and continues to do that, and we've been told at different times since the summer that the Home Office was considering sending people to the Falklands and to Ascension, and Angola. And now we're being told, perhaps, as you say, Rwanda and or Ghana. Given the apparent inability of the current government to actually deliver pretty much anything, do you think that this explanation of the intention to establish offshore detention centres, do you think that's credible, or is that the very peak of the red meat dead cat aspect of this story.
I don't think any of these measures will, if when we look back, it will be seen as having been effective in any way. They're clearly part of a wider populist political programme, because unfortunately there's a significant element in British society which actually welcomes a harsh approach to strangers, which welcomes sending them to some place like Rwanda or to some island, and which welcomes the Royal Navy sailing in to save us from this supposed threat. So that's to my mind, that's one of the most worrying things, is that there is an element in the population who will perhaps be more likely to vote Conservative again the next election, because they welcome that. They welcome that brutality.
Certainly, it does seem that this and the series of policy announcements that were trailed in the press over the weekend does certainly sound as if it is playing to the absolute base in many ways. But one final thing on this point, we heard when the Home Secretary was talking in the press a couple of months ago about how she was unhappy with the RNLI fulfilling their purpose and by their saving lives at sea. Now, Royal Naval personnel are under the same obligations to protect life at sea. So do you think we might find ourselves in a situation where, especially naval personnel, if they're actually involved in active operations, may find themselves in situations where they may begin to refuse orders to push small boats back into the English Channel?
That may be the case. I'm not in a position to know how likely that is. I mean, as you say, they do have that obligation in theory. Sometimes, though, in the fog of war, things tend to work out badly rather than for the best. So I'd be surprised, actually, if many commissioned officers are likely to refuse orders. They tend not to refuse orders.
It's been a long time since the mutiny at Invergordon, which I think was the last mutiny in the Royal Navy. But what we'll do is we'll move on to our next story now, and that is that a new report has warned that an additional 4 million households in England alone will face higher energy bill issues. The Resolution Foundation report estimates that millions of new households are at risk of fuel stress. That's where they are spending more than 10% of their household budget on energy, with energy prices set to rise by 50% overnight on April the 1st, due to the change in the energy price cap. The report also states the average energy bill will jump from £1,277 to around £2,000 a year, and warns of an overnight trebling of the number of households struck by fuel stress. In England, with no policy response from the UK government, this would see 27% of households fall into fuel stress. While the report makes no specific mention of Scotland, too many Scots also live in fuel poverty. In 2019, the Scottish Parliament passed the Fuel Poverty Act, enshrining into law commitments to drastically reduce the prevalence of households living in fuel poverty in Scotland by 2040. In 8 years, the Scottish Government has spent about £1 billion tackling fuel poverty, with as much as £114 million allocated last year alone on programmes targeted at improving energy efficiency in homes. The Resolution Foundation previously warned last year that with rising energy bills, cuts to universal credit, falling wages and rising inflation, that 2022 would be the year of the squeeze. So, John, do you think that a Tory Treasury, and this Treasury in particular, do you think that it will have the necessary perspective in order to, firstly, step into this crisis, and two, to fund that stepping into the crisis and that intervention from general taxation, as opposed to simply adding the cost of the intervention to the cost of energy for everyone else?
Well, we've seen already with regard to universal benefit, their unwillingness to consider the circumstances of many members of the population. A very large number who are struggling financially. As you pointed out, this could be an awful year, and a terrible year for much of the population, and millions across the UK, and certainly hundreds of thousands in Scotland who suffer the same. I mean, many parts of Scotland have a sequence of nights below zero Celsius. That tends not to occur in much of England, but if you have night after night below freezing, then the consequences of that, if you're impoverished, could be really quite deadly, I would say. And it's an unfortunate contrast that we see. We can see people will say, well, Norway is of course subsidising fuel costs for its citizens. People will say it's all very well for them with their massive funds from oil taxation. But France is making a move as well. I think I've seen a statement by Premier Macron indicating that in France people will not be allowed to fall into fuel poverty to that extent. I feel sure that many of the social democracies in Northern Europe will do the same. But the omens are not good for this government. They clearly don't care. We've got a narcissistic, psychopathic leadership, not just the Prime Minister, but many around them. Why would they care about poor? They won't care if poor die.
No, that's a very good point. And your point about President Macron announcing that he would use the golden share, which the French government retains in EDF, the former state electricity company, in order to require EDF to reduce their charges to domestic consumers, is also a good reminder of the way in which the UK has diverged from practice across most of Europe. Now, you were talking there about the most impoverished and the extent to which one might expect this Tory government to ignore their plight. The report says that the report from the Resolution Foundation today says that fuel stress levels are particularly high among pensioner households and those in poorly insulated homes, and that this is a stark reminder of the need to modernise Britain's leaky housing stock and curb national dependency on gas for power and heating. Now, the conjunction there of pensioner households and poorly insulated homes immediately made me think of, in England, in the context of England, made me think of red wall constituencies. How loudly do you think the domestic gas bill payers in red wall constituencies are going to have to shout before there is any political action taken to help them? Or will it, as usual with Johnson, be too little, too late?
Events like these, which don't seem to be particularly ideological to food prices, the cost of heating, the cost of petrol for cars, and so on, can sometimes turn into wider protests. You see that in other parts of the world, and so it may be that this may be enough to push the people of the north of England into more open protest against this government. And while they are an utterly callous and insensitive group in the UK government, they fear street protest. And if this was to develop, I think, into something, they would do something, I suppose. But in the end, it would be a elastoplast, I guess. There would be small subsidies for the most impoverished, who would then have to make tremendous effort to get the subsidies. So I'm not optimistic.
It's a good point that you make, though, John. As I recall it, the planning assumption for civil disobedience, for civil unrest, is that if people have missed 3 meals in a row, then you can expect trouble on the streets. And I wonder how that translates into energy poverty. And I have a suspicion we may find out as 2022, the winter of this winter, starts to roll forward. But we'll move on to our next story now, which is that Amazon and Visa appear to have agreed an 11th hour resolution to their bitter dispute after the online retailer told customers that they can continue to use Visa credit cards on the site. In November, Amazon told customers that from the 19th of January, it would stop accepting payments made with UK-issued Visa cards. At the time, Amazon blamed its decision on the high fees Visa charges for processing credit card transactions. Since then, the two companies have been engaged in what has been described as a game of corporate chicken. However, this morning, Amazon started sending affected customers emails telling them that they would be able to continue to use their Visa credit cards to pay for items and for Amazon Prime. Almost 90% of the people in the UK shop at Amazon, and its analysts have estimated that Amazon Prime membership in the UK to be about 21 million people. Last month, it was claimed that Amazon faced losing nearly £1.4 billion from UK shoppers had Visa credit cards been banned from the site. However, Visa too would have lost a huge chunk of revenue as customers would have been forced to use other cards. It now seems that the crisis talks that are thought to have happened over the weekend have borne fruit, and that a holding deal appears to have been put in place while a longer-term solution is worked on. Had the ban gone ahead, it would have hugely inconvenienced millions of people use a Visa credit card issued by providers, including Barclaycard. Amazon Prime would have lost hundreds of thousands of subscribers as payments lapsed. So, John, you and I will both admit to being Amazon customers, but I was wondering, what led, do you think, to this flexing of corporate muscle? Neither of these businesses is short of cash, and neither Amazon nor Visa would have done well. They would both have suffered if they had stopped doing business using Visa cards. So what do you think happened here?
I'm sorry, I'm going to be absolutely no use to you on this particular topic. I've got too much to say on some topics, but I know nothing about this. I don't have a credit card. I come from a background where people saved up to buy things. My dad would have been beside himself with anxiety at the idea of getting something and then paying it up over time. So I know nothing about this, I must admit. Sorry.
That's quite all right, John. What I will do, however, is I'll also talk to you about some of those numbers in there. 90% of UK citizens are Amazon customers. We were talking about broadcasting before. 21 million UK citizens are subscribers to Amazon Prime. Those numbers struck me as astonishing, especially when Amazon puts so very little back into the UK economy, paying almost no taxes and paying their staff largely as little as possible. So do you think, are we getting to a point where Amazon is too big? Will it be in a position to replace the BBC if the BBC goes into decline? And in terms of its strength in the retail market, do you think we're at a position now where Amazon will need to be reined in?
I think we're certain. I mean, it is a big number. I was quite taken aback by that, but I have an Amazon Prime account and I buy a great deal that way. I'm too lazy to go into town. I think the important thing is that it's not to think we can really do anything structural here, but we should definitely start taxing them properly, and that's where unfortunately we've weakened ourselves in that position by having pulled out of the EU, because these corporations are too big to be bullied by a single nation state like this. The EU is big enough to bully, not to bully, but to pressurize Amazon into cleaning up its act, paying tax and so on. The US is the same. China obviously is big enough to do that, but most countries are too small to do that. The UK is too small to do that. So clearly something has to be done here. I mean, it's quite a scary picture, isn't it, of Amazon dominating in that way. So I think in a democracy like this, we need to get a government that's got the discipline and the courage to, as you said, rein them in, do something about them.
Thanks, John. We'll move on to an international story now, and that is that the new German foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, has sought to reassure a nervous Ukraine that she will not allow Germany to compromise on the basic principles of Ukraine's territorial sovereignty when she meets the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Moscow for the first time on Tuesday. Baerbock, who's a member of the Green Party, said on a visit to Kiev that she was ready for serious dialogue with Russia about mutual security, but was not willing to backtrack on basic principles such as territorial inviolability, the free choice of alliances, and the renunciation of the threat of violence. She said Moscow, which has amassed troops on Ukraine's borders, would suffer if it launched an attack. Each further aggressive act will have a high price for Russia, economically, strategically, and politically, she told a news conference with her Ukrainian counterpart, Dmytro Kuleba. Diplomacy, she said, is the only way. Her visit is being watched warily by European, UK, and US administrations for signs that Germany may revert to its traditional role of seeking independent dialogue with Russia in preference to joint firmness. So, John, firstly, we have a new government in Germany, and it might be said that the statements made by the new German foreign minister suggest that Germany might take a different approach. We historically, certainly since the end of the Second War, Germany has been very careful in its dealings with Russia, and might be said to have been accommodating in some circumstances, choosing to plough its own diplomatic furrow and not fall into line with the US or the EU. So do you think is this an indication that we might be seeing a change from the German government and that they're prepared to take a tougher line with Moscow?
I think not. I think it's just talk. The Russians are clearly keen to reassert themselves within the shell of the Soviet Union, and they're paranoid about, maybe not paranoid, justifiably anxious about the attempts by NATO to further hem them in, and to bring various parts of the former Soviet Union into NATO. So there's clearly some fairly simple power politics going on there. I don't know whether the Russians really intend to invade, but I'm absolutely certain if they did invade, Germany would do nothing. The US would do nothing, nor would any other Western power do anything about it. They would try then and impose sanctions of various kinds. The Germans are dependent on Russian gas, heavily dependent on Russian gas. So there clearly are limitations to just how seriously they would actually impose sanctions on Russia. So it's rather sadly, if from the point of view of the Ukrainian people, I don't think really that were the Russians to be serious about this, that anybody's coming to the raid. It's kind of a bit like Munich in 1938 or 9 or whatever, isn't it? As the
Yes.
Germans become Chamberlain.
No, I think that's very fair, John. And I certainly was depressed. I was talking on Friday to a Ukrainian and an Irishman, and the Ukrainian was talking in detail about the preparations and plans that are being made among some sectors of the Ukrainian society in preparation for an asymmetric war of the kind of conflict that we saw on the island of Ireland, which is deeply, deeply depressing. This, I'm sure, is a story that we are going to continue to pay close attention to throughout 2022 and beyond. But we'll move on now.
I don't think the Russians would, even if the Russians do invade, I don't think they would have in mind a complete conquest of all of the Ukraine. I think it would be a partial nibbling at the edges. And there are significant parts of the Ukraine, as you know, which are inhabited by people of Russian ethnicity, you might argue, who speak Russian, who will not resist. There are some amongst them who will resist. But so it might be that, Russia, let's hope they don't, but it might be they will actually invade and take part of the Ukraine and satisfy themselves with that. I don't know. It's deeply unacceptable and it's unpleasant, but, worse things happen in the world.
Power politics, as you said earlier, absolutely. We'll move to our next story, and that is that Sweden's security service has taken over an investigation regarding unauthorized drones at 3 Swedish nuclear power plants on Friday, it said on a statement today. Police in Sweden deployed patrols and helicopters to the Forsmark nuclear plant to hunt for a drone seen flying over the site late on Friday, but were unable to catch the unmanned vehicle. Police said the drone was large and able to operate despite high winds at the Forsmark plant. The Swedish Security Service said earlier today that drones had also been sighted at Sweden's 2 other nuclear power plants at Oskarshamn and Ringhals. Around 30% of Sweden's total power production comes from the 3 plants. These incidents come a day after Sweden's military started patrolling the main town on the Baltic Sea island of Gotland, amid increased tensions between NATO and Russia, and a recent deployment of Russian landing craft in the Baltic. In general, the security threats against Sweden have increased with a broader and more in-depth intelligence threat and a more complex threat picture, the Security Service said in the statement. So, following on from our last story, John, in some senses, Sweden and the Baltic states feel that they are very much on the front line with Russia. And of course, there is a history of friction. I'm thinking of Russian submarines found in Swedish and Danish waters over the years, certainly in the last couple of decades. So do you think we should be surprised that the Swedes have found drones flying next to their 3 nuclear power stations?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? We seem to, a few years ago, or quite recently, have the suggestion that drones were going to be a big problem in the UK, in particular around airports. Remember 1 or 2 stories, airports being closed. And then sometimes the drone couldn't actually be identified, or the drone owner couldn't be identified. I think there are some ghost drones out there in the UK. But the situation in Sweden, I'm sure these were real drones, and probably part of that kind of teasing and poking that the Russians like to do with their neighbours. I'm not sure it goes much beyond posturing. I think they've been doing something like this since the Soviet era, and they continue really just to kind of posture like this to remind the other countries that they are a power to be respected.
Yes, I think that's a very, very fair point. The events that have played out in England and Salisbury might be put in the same context, perhaps. But I was going to take you back to December 2018 when, as you pointed out, London's airports were paralysed for several days after repeated sightings of drones inside the airport perimeters. And I'm reminded in the context of drones of the reporting that we see from all across the Middle East and Africa and other conflict zones of the use of drones in war zones as weapons. So in the context of security concerns in Sweden, disruption to safe civil aviation in the UK, and the apparent widespread use of drones as weapons, do you think it's about time that we think about more strict regulation of these devices?
Well, I'm a bit curious as to why nothing much has happened. Did you say it was 2018 these drones closed down an airport for a while? Well, there've been very few stories since then in the UK. It seems almost like it was some kind of moral panic that's just faded away, and that some of the drones were perhaps imaginary.
Absolutely, John. It was a Christmas time story that came and went, but it's certainly I'm also reminded that with the expansion and the use of this sort of technology, unmanned vehicles and drones getting bigger and bigger, that there is the potential for them to continue to be used for all sorts of purposes, positive and negative.
Yeah. I mean, that's clearly true in other parts of the world. I mean, we saw drone attacks today, of course, in the United Arab Emirates. Drones probably owned by Yemenis, angry against the United Arab Emirates' involvement in the war there, the civil war there. And we've seen, of course, over the last, I don't know how many, 10 or more years, the use of drones by the US to take out opponents across much of the Arab world. So clearly the drone is where we're going, I think. It's a low-cost way of killing, because it's low cost in every sense. The vehicle's quite low cost compared to fighter jets and bombers, and you don't need to send your own troops there. So, I mean, it clearly is a growing problem. I'm not sure how the situation in Scotland or in the UK and Sweden, whether they're part of the same phenomenon.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. We'll move to our next story now, which is that the Stay in Scotland campaign has been relaunched with updated resources to help EU citizens living in Scotland access and prove their immigration status online using the UK government's View and Prove service. Although the Scottish Government continues to push the UK Government to offer physical proof of immigration status, EU citizens currently have to use the Home Office's digital-only system to prove their rights in the UK. The Scottish Government is concerned that many people are struggling to use this system to prove their immigration status, putting them at risk of losing work, accommodation and access to benefits. The Europe Minister Jenny Gilruth said, "We value the contribution of EU citizens that they make to our country, and we are concerned that many people are experiencing difficulties with the UK Government's View and Prove service. Vulnerable citizens in particular are finding it challenging to prove their status to service providers and employers. We've now updated our resources to help EU citizens navigate the UK Government's digital-only system and to ensure they still have access to work, accommodation and benefits." So, John, firstly, why do you think the UK Government continues to resist providing EU citizens with physical proof of their status? Is it because the UK Government thinks that they don't matter, or that they don't deserve it?
I think the UK government is entirely cynical in this. I think they think it's popular with their voters. That's why they continue to be unsympathetic towards migrants of any kind, including EU citizens, despite the fact that those EU citizens played a major part in helping us get through the first wave of the virus, of the pandemic. So it's interesting to see the letters, the attempts by the Scottish Government to compensate for all of this. The letters from Jean Freeman, Health Secretary, and from the First Minister back around the time of Brexit, I think were wonderful pieces of writing, and they did their best. But of course, the power remains where it is in Westminster with regard to this. But we must salute every attempt by the Scottish Government to try and help EU citizens to stay, because clearly, we need them, and we need more.
Absolutely. I was going to ask you about that, John, because I was wondering about how does the continued approach of the devolved governments, the Welsh and Northern Ireland, as well as the Scots Government, how does their continued approach seeking to reassure EU citizens that they matter and that we would really like them to stay and remain part of our society and our communities, how do you think that's starting to play out in political terms? I'm thinking both of general elections and perhaps Indy Ref 2.
Well, I've got mixed feelings about that. I'm not too sure in terms of the polls whether the Scottish government or the other devolved governments working really hard to keep EU citizens is universally popular across the electorate in Scotland or in those places. I'm not too sure about that. I think it's the right thing to do. I applaud it. I'm entirely with it. And I think there are significant elements in the Scottish electorate who understand that it's a good thing to do and it's an important thing to do and it's a pragmatic thing to do in terms of staffing our health service and so on. But I'm not entirely sure that it's entirely sensible from a political perspective to make too much of it, because we can see in England, we can see in the UK government, they clearly identify not being helpful to EU citizens goes down quite well.
Absolutely, thank you, John. We're certainly moving away from the positive way in which we started the programme to the more negative approach. Yeah. It's almost inevitable when discussing Westminster, their hostile environment and their approach to people of a different colour of skin or a different place of birth. But we'll move to our final story now, which is that around 12,000 students will assist in the safe delivery of health and social care as services continue to respond to the pandemic. More than 3,000 nursing and midwifery students are heading out on placements this month. A further 7,000 students will be placed across the service in February, complemented by around 1,500 allied health professional students and more than 500 paramedic students, who will all also be involved in the delivery of care via supervised practice. The practical component of student learning remains centred on supervised involvement in the frontline delivery of patient care, as part of accruing the hours necessary for registration as a healthcare professional. It is an integral part of the work of the ongoing work to respond to the challenges of COVID-19 and is greatly valued by the workforce. So, John, firstly, innovation in professional education and education away from what you call the sacred space of the classroom. What do you think?
I can hardly criticise this. I mean, certainly in certain career paths, it makes sense to get out there and get some experience rather than sitting about in the classroom. So, 12,000 is a very large number. There are only around 70,000 in total in nursing, midwifery, and nursing assistants. So 12,000 is a big boost. And I think a further, how many paramedics? Oh, 500 paramedics. I don't know how many paramedics there are. This seems to me another example of the kind of sensible and careful management of an NHS that we haven't seen in England, but we do see here, despite the regular media attacks on it. Infection levels are plummeting at the moment in Scotland. I mean, they're down about half what they were last week, and they're heading down, I think, to where we're heading for an endemic rather than a pandemic scenario where people start to live with this virus, still wearing face masks in certain circumstances, but otherwise getting quite closely back to normal. So this seems like a good move, but it may be that it's not entirely needed. The NHS is under pressure at the moment, but nowhere near the pressure it experienced in February. And it looks as if the trends are all going the other way. Hospital admissions are flat at the moment, at about 2/3 to 3/4 of what they were in February. That's liable to dip quite soon as infection in the wake of infection levels. So, good, sensible move. Not the first good, sensible move we've seen, but hopefully it won't be too important.
Thanks, John. And thinking about education more generally, it struck me that in the context of education more generally, that the necessary response to the pandemic forced or strongly encouraged teachers and other educators to embrace alternative means of delivering education other than in the classroom. And we're seeing here alterations and adjustments being made to the education path for nursing and midwifery students, paramedics and others. So do you think in education more generally, do you think the education sector is going to respond positively to the experience and the requirements of the pandemic, and we're going to see education continue to evolve and change as a result of what's been learned?
There will be some return, I'm sure, because there are powerful cultural pressures to have students and to have staff back in a place. Managers become anxious if they're not there. and teachers become anxious if they don't see students. They start to think their jobs are endangered. But 60 years after the Open University, maybe 70 years, about 70 years after the Open. I'm hearing other voices there. That's why I'm hesitating. I think there will be some changes that will last. I think there's been a bit of a paradigm shift, and I think all for higher education in particular, maybe less so schools education. I think teachers have got much more of a grip on their tradition there and won't let it go easily.
Thank you, John. And you have a perspective on education in particular. And I'm glad that we got to that story this evening and that you were able to comment. Thank you. Yes. So my apologies. I'm getting instructions here. We've seen reporting this afternoon, John, we've seen Dominic Cummings blogging this afternoon, insisting that MPs should look very carefully and clearly at the simple facts of the Prime Minister being asked by his PPS whether or not they should have a drinks reception, a party at Downing Street. That the PPS was told by the Prime Minister in no uncertain terms that it should go ahead, that two other members of his staff objected, pointing out the problems that would arise, but that the Prime Minister persisted with the plan and participated in the party. So in terms of the way in which the politics here are playing out, I think it's tolerably clear that Dominic Cummings is doing his level best to bring down his former boss. What do you think the prospects are for Cummings in terms of his ongoing campaign and briefing against the Prime Minister?
Cummings has skills, and he'll find employment elsewhere, I'm sure, when he needs it with other career psychopaths like himself. It's kind of entertaining, isn't it, when like rats in a sack, when a bunch of psychopaths turn on each other and try and blame each other. I feel sure some poor civil servants, Cabinet Office people, there will be an attempt at least to make them take to fall on their swords and take the blame, and Boris will try and excuse himself, as he's done so many times, by suggesting that it wasn't his decision, that he was advised wrongly. They'll try that line. There has to be a point at which that doesn't work, and I wonder if we're getting to that point, that people have had enough. I mean, the opinion polls are widening fast now, so the deeply unimpressive new Labour Party is now sometimes 10-12% ahead in the opinion polls. They're getting into a winning position, regardless of their complete lack of attraction for the average intelligent person. So it's just funny, I think, to watch Cummings and Boris fight each other.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. And that was our final item this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. If you would like to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. We really need all of the financial assistance that we can get in order to do more of what we already do. And of course, as we discussed earlier this evening, Broadcasting Scotland is entirely dependent upon voluntary donations. And so we value and would encourage you to donate or subscribe if you are able. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meantime, we will be here again tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock for the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in. I'd like to say thanks to Professor John Robertson for joining us this evening. Thanks, John.
My pleasure.
And also, thanks to everyone for watching us on Broadcasting Scotland. So that's the way it is at very nearly Scotland at 8. I hope that everybody keeps warm and keeps well. Bye-bye.